Hello and welcome to my shop. My name is George and I'm coming to you from Chelsea, Quebec. Now, just a little while ago I published a video of my not really a Moxon Work-Alike. So this is a hunk of lumber strapped to the workbench with a series of mounting holes so that you can clamp pieces to the bench. And it's working out really well. It's ideally suited for working objects at a low level. Something like planing, for instance, gets done really well with this. But I thought to myself that it would also be interesting to have a Moxon that you can clamp in place that raises the work a little bit. And I'm thinking specifically of something like sawing dovetails, for example. And so I put together this. And now there are dozens and dozens of Moxon construction builds on YouTube. But this one shares a feature with its cousin, and that's that it's adjustable. So I'll talk a little bit about it, and we'll take it from there. So let me say a few words about my Moxon-On-Moxon. I know it sounds a bit like an English Hamlet, but I like that name for it, Moxon-On-Moxon. The scrap material that I had lying around was maple, and the boards were a little heavy on 3/4 of an inch. There's a wide board at the back. It's wider than the rest of them, and this extra tail was put in so that I could just slip it into the Moxon that's already on the bench, and I could just cinch it up like this. So one large panel that's a little bit wider in the back, two more panels glued together so that the back three are all glued together. And why so thick in the back? Well, I needed clearance so that a panel can drop through and clear the chop on the existing Moxon, on the bench Moxon. The floating panel has a 45-degree chamfer in the front, and that's so that if you wanted to saw a blind dovetail, you could bring the saw at an angle like this and it'll work out. Now, I have not yet made a blind dovetail, but that's in my future for sure. The hardware, in this case I'm using 1/4 inch hardware. It was 1/2 inch down here, so 1/4 inch. And instead of trapping nuts, now the nuts are, they're T-nuts. So instead of using nuts, I'm using T-nuts. And they're trapped in between the back panel and the first of the two panels over here. I chose T-nuts because you can get them with a fairly long threaded portion, more than you would get with just a single nut. 4 inches apart in the center, and then roughly 2-inch intervals after that running out to the end. So for those of you who've got some experience in the shop, I think I've described this thing enough so that you can go off and build it without having to watch the rest of the video. The rest of the video has scenes from the actual construction of this, and of course you're welcome to stay. But if you've decided to bail, let me just be sure to wish you time for your passion, and don't forget to share it. So let's move on and see some scenes from the construction of this thing. So I'm using 3 panels made of maple from an abandoned project. The panels themselves are a little better than 3/4 of an inch thick. One of the panels will be the back, and it's the one that's going to get trapped in the existing Moxon. Another panel was ripped into 2. It's sitting here waiting for the glue to cure, and it also is going to get glued to this back panel. and it's doubly thick so that it gives me the clearance that I need to get past this chop. And then finally the last panel will be the same width as these two glued together panels, and it's going to form the loose chop sitting in front. Now these dovetails were cut for the previous project, so they're not relevant to this one. The next step is going to be to clean up these two panels that have been glued together, and to bore the recesses for the nuts that are going to be trapped behind. Then it'll get glued to the back panel.
It's a problem that is far too common. It is not properly recognized. It's a problem called pedophilia. James Cantor is a clinical psychologist.
So when it comes time to glue the panels together, I don't want them to slip and slide past each other. So I'm going to bore some holes for some very skinny dowels that'll run through the two boards, and we'll keep them on register as I clamp them. So I'll put a pair at one end, a pair at the other end, and a pair at the middle. So the full length of this is 17.5 inches. So quickly now, what's 17.5 divided by 2? Well, it's still 17.5 if you have a tape measure like this, because it has full inches running along the top and half inches running along the bottom. So all I have to do is find the mark that says 17.5, and I've got my middle. Why not simplify your life? Barbecue skewers. So the two thick panels are held onto the back panel with a couple of skewers just temporarily, but you can see how it's coming together now. The back panel will fit into the bench vise like this. You cinch it up over here. And the the two thick panels in the front clear the space below. What's not shown here is there's going to be a floating panel that I'll be cinching up. Now I've decided to use 1/4 inch hardware up here, so 1/4 by 20. And so before gluing it together, I'll be boring holes to put a bunch of T-nuts at intervals in right here behind the two, I'm calling them front panels right now, behind the thick panels. So I'll be boring a shallow 3/4 inch hole for the flange, a little bit deeper 5/16 inch for the body of the T-nut, and then finally the rest of the hole will be 1/4 inch so the bolt can pass through. And I'm also going to continue the 1/4 inch bore in the back panel. That'll give me a little bit more room to play, so I won't have to worry that much about bottoming out. So I decided a little arbitrarily on 4 inches apart in the center, and then 2-inch intervals after that. And this saddle square is approximately 2 inches wide, so it's perfect for marking off what I need. So when your shaft calls for holes of different diameters, start with the biggest diameter first, because that'll leave a centering dimple for the next sizes to follow. I'm holding it very loosely at the beginning to let the drill find its center. But then as it nears the bottom, I'm holding it very firmly so that I don't get tear out at the other end. So here I'm going to mark for the points of the T-nut. I want to bore some clearance holes in the back panel, so I'll put it back together again on register using the skewers. And I'll mark the position I want. Like that's going to look great on camera. These holes are just to provide clearance, so I'm boring them at a 1/16 of an inch over size, so 5/16 instead of 1/4. So now I'm going to use the double thick panel that you've seen again and again so far. I'm going to use that to register alignment with front panel. So I've clamped the doubly thick one to the new front panel, and I'll mark it for holes. Now these are going to be through holes, and they don't have to be perfectly aligned. So I'll make them a 32nd, maybe a 1/16 of an inch oversize. So I'm sorry I didn't film the gluing. I forgot to turn the camera on, and then once I started gluing, things got really hectic. But in the process, you've probably seen a million times before on other YouTube channels. I coated the back of the thick pieces with glue. I ran the skewers in to the wider back piece to get the alignment right, and then I just loaded up the clamps. So I'm going to undo these clamps now and do Using a 1/4-inch bit for 1/4-inch bolts made the fit too tight. I needed to enlarge the bore. Here I'm adjusting the depth to stop just short of the trapped T-nuts. I enlarged all of the holes by a 32nd of an inch, and 2 of them needed a 1/16 of an inch. So after a little trial and error fitting, I worked it out that a 3-inch bolt will be just the right size so that I can work 1 inch and 3/4 inch material. So I'm using these knobs. Now these are uncommitted. They're uncommitted in the sense that you can turn them into sockets by dropping a nut in place. I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but there's a hexagonal shape right at the bottom. So a tapered cylinder opening, and then right at the bottom there's a hex shape that snugs up to a nut, or if you wanted a male, it'll snug up to the head of a bolt. Now I want to be able to push these in a little bit. I don't want them backing out. So I made these filler blocks using 3D printing, tapered cylinder, and then the last couple of millimeters there's a hex shape that snugs right into the opening when there's a bolt head in place. So we'll just find the right orientation and push it in. So that, with a little glue gun, should get me into shape here. Yeah, that should do it. And it looks pretty as well. Just a little cleanup after having cut a 45 degree on the table saw. So it's pretty well finished. There's a little bit of cleanup left to do. I ran some epoxy here to fill in some cracks, and so I need to clean that up with a little bit of planing, you know, sanding, whatever it takes. And because I made this thing in maple, I am going to soften its faces, either with a little bit of suede, but I'm going to try first some of that shelving liner that you can get. It's about a 1/16 of an inch thick and a little bit spongy. I'll see how that works out first. So yeah, that's pretty well it for this video. Whatever you do, make some time for your passion and share it.